Hi, everybody. My name is Michael Magursky. Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate being able to talk to an audience that's a little bit outside of our area of expertise. This talk was co-written by myself and my colleague Tom Carden, who isn't here today, but the whole first half of it is a little bit of a informal telepresence from him. So again, we're Stamen Design. We're a small service firm in San Francisco, about 6 or 7 people or so currently. We do, as we said, information visualization, map making, other sorts of online visual design technology work for a number of different kinds of clients. The project that I'm going to be talking about today is Oakland Crime Spotting. This falls into the kind of research area of the work that we do. It's a project that was started by myself about 1.5 years ago or so, when I became dissatisfied with the kind of crime publishing that the Oakland Police Department was doing online. It kind of trundled along as a side project, a research project, a weekend thing for a long time. And then as we developed something more like a robust way of getting the information from the Oakland PD website, we turned it into a real project. So if you go to the website today, what you would see if you were to zoom out is something like this. It's a map, fairly zoomed out currently. It shows you how small the city of Oakland is in comparison to the rest of the Bay Area, but also a pretty dense chunk of coverage inside Oakland. You've got time navigation on the lower left-hand side. You've got navigation of different crime types on the lower right-hand side. And you can do a lot of the types of slippy map interactions that things like Google Maps and Microsoft Virtual Earth have been allowing people to do on the web for a number of years now. So you can start to zoom in, expand the range of time that's shown, expand the range of different crimes that are shown, zoom in a little bit further to get more detail on a kind of street-by-street level, and then ultimately see things in a non-mapped way. So this is an example of one of the listing pages that we have, which I'll be talking about a little bit later, that shows individual crime reports from around the city kind of split out from the map context and listed out. You go from that all the way down to permalink pages for individual reports around the city. So this one is a murder that happened on March 5th at 6 in the morning. But first I'd like to go back a little bit and just do a little bit of background for why we're interested in crime maps and then some thinking about Stamen's work itself. I guess the first thing to say, knowing that you guys are going to be talking about databases and map mashups here in this context, is that the idea of doing online crime maps in this kind of format is definitely not something that we came up with, and definitely not something that's unique to this area or this discipline. Probably the grandfather of all this stuff would be Adrian Holovati's chicagocrime.org, which I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with. Similar project. It was one of the first Google Maps mashups that was produced before the Google Maps API became public in about 2005 or so. It's been around for a number of years. It's the same kind of thing. What Adrian realized was that the crime information that was being represented on the website that the Chicago PD was publishing was not very helpful to people. It was hard to find things near you, but they were publishing block-level addresses. So he began a process of scraping that information from the web, republishing it in a map context, and kind of made waves because it was one of the first uses of technology like Google Maps to show people's own information. That, along with housing maps and a few other things, was the kind of genesis of cracking open the nut of Google and getting them to release an API for this stuff so that it was kind of publicly accessible and usable to people. There's a lot of this kind of stuff online. This is a particular blog post from a site called Journalistopia that talks about a number of these things. So they mention ours, they mention Chicago Crime, something from LA, a number of other projects. So this is definitely happening all over the place. Some companies are turning this into a service that you can use online. So crimereports.com has taken the approach of aggregating this stuff for a number of cities and trying to convince police departments to proactively publish information into the crimereports.com database. So this is their homepage. You can see that there's some states on this map that are darker than others. Those are ones where they have jurisdictions that are publishing information. If you actually zoom into this thing, you can begin to see that, for example, Washington, D.C., or places around California, you'll have police departments that don't have the IT infrastructure to support creating these kinds of things, but they're perfectly happy to take databases of info, push them into something like crimereports.com, and then create a situation where you as a visitor can come and see not just your town, but neighboring towns next door. That's something I'll get into a little bit later. And this stuff is starting to express itself also in various ways. So everyblock.com is kind of an outgrowth of the Chicago Crime Project that Adrian started. This is an attempt to get it away from just Chicago and also to get this kind of mapping away from just crime. So you've got various kinds of things like building permits, business reviews, crime, excavation permits, liquor licenses. I think Adrian really has this concept of database journalism fairly down to a T in terms of figuring out what cities publish about themselves and then getting that into an online format where you can see that there's, you know, failing restaurant reviews next door to film inspections, lost and found, misconnections, all this kind of stuff. So it's a lot of data that's being put together into a map. Currently, they're doing it for San Francisco, for Chicago, and for New York. I know that they're starting to look at other markets around the country and basically try to figure out which big cities are good candidates for this stuff. I think as far as they're concerned, a good candidate is both a city that has a lot of people in it, but also one that publishes information about itself. So places like San Francisco, for example, will make things like GIS files of tax parcels and so on around the city available for public use, where a lot of other cities won't do that sort of thing. We're also seeing this pushed into other directions. This is the front page of something called Not Just a Number, which is a product of the Oakland Tribune here in the Bay Area, and it focuses on a much more narrative way of talking about crime in Oakland. It focuses on all the homicides that have been happening there and really drills into each one. So rather than just saying, you know, 5 a.m. somebody got killed, it talks about who those people are, who their family members are, who the perpetrator is, you know, kind of gets into the more narrative storytelling aspect of this stuff by focusing on a very narrow slice of the kind of information that's out there. You can contrast that with something like the SF Gates homicide database, where it's your basic kind of Google Map mashup, but what they're focusing on here is the fact that the San Francisco Police Department, although they published their crime information, they removed all of the homicide information. Not sure exactly when, might have been about 6 months ago or so, but they basically just stripped that information clean. So the Chronicle and the SF Gate sort of took it upon themselves to get in there and figure out, okay, if the police aren't going to publish this information, clearly we have to find it from someplace else and put it into a format where people can see it. Los Angeles Times did this as well. They're also doing a lot of this kind of race, ethnicity, age kind of slicing, where you can break down all the different events that are happening around town based on, you know, where they're happening, what the characteristics of the people involved are. I think they have some other details like, you know, whether it was a gun or, you know, a knife crime, those kind of things. So they're really interested in this as kind of a slice through the information presentation, where you can get in there and really start cutting it up and see what's going on. There's a lot of examples of this kind of stuff. I think the last one I'll show is the New York Times Casualty of War page. This is a kind of crime report. This is more about the Iraq War. But what they're doing here is they're breaking it up by time and then showing different ways of slicing the data, similarly to how the LA Times does it, but in a much richer interactive flash format. So if you look at this on the New York Times webpage, you'll see that as you drag this slider back and forth over time, the circles here will change size, showing which province of Iraq deaths are happening in. These bar charts will change size, showing the age, branch of military, race, type of duty information. So it's a really interactive piece, and we think it's one of the better examples out there of a reactive data visualization project. Aside from crime mapping, we at Stamen also do a lot of general mapping work. So I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about the kind of background of why we in particular are interested in this stuff, so that the crime spotting site makes a little bit more sense in that context. So as I said, we're a service firm, so clients give us money and we deliver work to them, typically work for hire. We do work for all kinds of clients, but the map making focus has really come out over the past 3 or 4 years. Starting with some early work that my partner Eric did around 16th and Mission in San Francisco, where our office is located, kind of running into the MoveOn work that was mentioned, and then now down into real estate stuff and so on. So the most recent map project that we've been thinking about, if it will, there we go, is something called hindsight.trulia.com. This is a project for a real estate company that has huge listings of real estate residential properties all around the country. They take information from brokers, from county tax assessors, from Craigslist all over the place, basically whatever they can find out there. And they put it on the web, and you can look things up, figure out where your house is, how much it's worth, when it was last sold, how many bedrooms, all the kind of typical real estate data functions that you might want to see. But what they were finding was that people could see, you know, an individual property or maybe an individual cluster of properties in a particular zip code, but it was really difficult to kind of convey a sense of the hugeness of the information that they have. They really have pretty much every county around the US. So they were interested in a more dynamic way of showing what's actually going on in their database so that people could understand that there's just a ton of stuff here. So we created this piece called Trulia Hindsight, which is kind of a dynamic data visualization marketing piece. The idea was to create an interface where people could see all the history of the data in the Trulia website in a dynamic, interesting, kind of playable format. So what you're seeing here is the entire San Francisco Bay Area. There's a slider on the bottom of it that shows the year that properties were built, which is one of the core pieces of information that Trulia has. And you can kind of run it back and forth over the website. This behaves like a Google Slippy map. So you can zoom in, you can get into a particular neighborhood. This is Plano, Texas, as kind of a little bit of contrast, where instead of the whole Bay Area view, you really get this kind of individual street view. And you can see that, you know, this whole area is kind of post-invention of air conditioning construction, where you really get these huge swaths of development that are just being chunked out kind of block by block by block. These are individual streets with individual houses on them. All the development is concentrated really in the last 20 to 30 years or so. So it's a pretty stark contrast to what was going on in San Francisco. The development process for this kind of stuff is super experimental on our end. We didn't talk to Trulia about how to develop this kind of map and then go off and do it. We did a lot of experimental work with them, trying to understand what that might look like. So what you're seeing here is the same sort of information. It's still San Francisco. It's still navigating through time. But this is a really early experiment that we did, where they gave us blobs of data connected to certain areas like San Francisco. We went off, did something that we thought was interesting with it, and then kind of iterated over that with them. So here you've got construction time. We were also interested in things like housing price. So this is the same sort of deal, only it's looking at the price of houses in San Francisco. So you can see that as you kind of get up into Laurel Heights, up into the $2 million range, housing really tends to concentrate in certain parts of the city. Ultimately, this as an experiment turned out to be less successful than the construction date thing, largely because it's just really hard to rationalize the price of a house over time, because you have things like housing prices really wildly inflating over the past couple of years, making it look as though things are being built that are more valuable when really they might not be. The value of the dollar changes. It's just really hard to normalize this stuff over time. And it's also hard, I think, for people to kind of look at this and get a visceral, personal sense of what's going on in their neighborhood that they might get from something that shows construction times, where they can say, oh, okay, this was built in the 50s, and then I remember this new area from the 60s, getting into the 80s. It's a lot more personal. So people really reacted to the Trulia project, I think, in some of the ways that we were really hoping that they would. They discovered pretty early on that we had a permalinking feature, so that if you zoom to your hometown out in Massachusetts, you could share that as a link with people. It was something that was passed around. It was linked to in that way, as opposed to just, you know, set piece cities like San Francisco or Boston or New York and so on. We also experimented with a lot of visual displays of this stuff. So one of the first obvious things that you do is you take a satellite map and you kind of make everything red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, the kind of scientist rainbow concept of how you do color navigation. And we found that there was some unfortunate kind of accidental visual resonance with this stuff. This is a photograph of the Berkeley Hills fire from just over there about 17 years ago. And you can really see that it has the same kind of visual appearance as Trulia. But of course, this is houses burning and people losing their property. We didn't like the idea that a piece that we were doing for a client looked like war, looked like kind of Missile Command or this kind of thing. So we were really trying to go for cooler colors, kind of communicate something a little bit less horrifying in a way. So that's Trulia Hindsight. It's kind of an example of a lot of the different kinds of map research that we do. This is something that I did fairly recently, which is a interactive Slippy map version of Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion projection. General idea here is that rather than viewing the Earth as a flat plane with certain distorted areas, we were thinking about how do you kind of centralize focus on particular spots? So Buckminster Fuller had this idea of turning the world into a kind of closed icosahedron shape that you unfold as you might an orange peel, and then you can focus yourself on any given point on the globe. So here you've got it centralized on San Francisco, and then as you kind of pan further away, you can see that the globe kind of unfolds, and you get concepts like what is close to San Francisco that you might not see from your typical Mercator projection. This is not a commercial project, it's just something that we do to kind of experiment with map representation. But it tends to feed itself into a lot of the other work that we do. So this is something that we did for a group called My Society in London, and they are in some ways similar to us. They're interested in civic information in kind of a scraping data kind of format. So what they were interested in was how do you rationalize things like housing prices and travel times around London. They live in London. It's really expensive to live there. It's really tough to get around from place to place. So they commissioned us to do some maps that explored the idea of travel time around the city. The idea was that here it's focused on the Olympic Stadium site. How long does it take to get there at 9 a.m. if you get on public transit from wherever you live, as a sort of way to choose where your house might be. So you can see that as you kind of move the slider up at the top from 0 minutes up to 100 minutes or so, the city of London really kind of expands and unfolds, and it's really just a small area in the center that's reasonable to get around in like 20, 30 minutes. As soon as you get up to like 40, 45 minutes, the rest of it expands. You can see these kind of circular blobs around the tube stations all over the place. Pretty interesting, kind of minimal, but
Question?
yeah.
Seeing that animation reminds me of like fractal drawings. Is there some kind of correlation there, or is that coincidence?
No, it's not fractal. I guess it's fractal in the sense that cities kind of build themselves in a really fractal kind of construction where you end up with, you know, very small features in the center and then broader kind of suburban developments as you get further out. The way that this was constructed was just by, you know, choosing the Olympic Stadium site as a center point and then scraping the website of Transport for London and just saying, given that I have to be here at 9 a.m., how long does it take me to get there from here, from here, from here, from here, from here, basically for every pixel in this map. So it was a super time-consuming process for them. But I think ultimately what they want to get out of this is some concept of this being a piece that somebody with the computing resources or the database could turn into something that works for everybody. So let's say you don't work at the Olympic Stadium site. Let's say you work someplace in West London. Can you have a map like this for your own house? So that, or, you know, for your own place of work, so you can figure out where you would want to live. This immediately suggested, I'm just going to stop that for a second. What this immediately suggested was the idea of intersecting that information with something like house price. So the initial thing was travel time, the secondary thing is house price, and now what you can do is for everything that's within 100 minutes of the Olympic Stadium site, what are the different housing prices that are there? So here what's happening is you're navigating across kind of a thin slice of house price. This is about 250,000 pounds to 340,000 pounds. As you move it forward and backwards, you can begin to see that you go from cheaper housing in the east of London to wildly expensive housing in the west of London. Once you get to that little chunk in the west there, that's like Russian oligarch territory and extremely large houses. We found some pretty cool results from this stuff. I mean, I think this was a comment that was left on Delicious in response to the piece, and I think it really kind of encapsulates what we were going for with this, which was this idea that if you can map two variables against each other in a way that's not textually understandable, but is visually understandable, you can immediately get to an answer like this. Like, oh, okay, if I only have 300,000 pounds to spend and I want to live within 30 minutes of my office, there's really only this one chunk of town that I can actually live in. And it's something that you kind of become aware of as you live in a place over a long period of time. But through visualizing that information, it becomes a lot more apparent as opposed to, you know, searching through Craigslist and trying to figure out like where the hell are all the cheap houses and not really knowing where to find that stuff. Just going to speed through some more of this stuff. Modest Maps is a framework that we built a while back that really underpins a lot of these projects. It's a Flash-based framework for doing these kind of slippy interactive maps. And the reason why we find it interesting is mostly just because we've taken a kind of activity, which is this sort of visualization and map making, and made a piece of work that causes that to be a simpler thing to produce. So Modest Maps, it's an open source framework, lets us do things like Oakland Crime Spotting and Trulia and so on in a really kind of easy and simple way. It came out of work like cabspotting.org, which is the Exploratorium piece that was mentioned earlier. This traces live GPS positions of taxi cabs around San Francisco. It's connected to something called mapper.com, which we did a couple years back from when the Flickr API was first made available. We became interested in what kind of future GPS visualization of photography would look like. So we looked at county names, state names, and town names that were attached to photographs as tags and used that as kind of a placeholder for location information. In the meantime, Flickr has added their own geographic information, but I think that this thing coming through about 4 years ago or so kind of pointed the way towards what that might look like to people who were accidentally geocoding their photography just by saying that they took it in a certain place or a certain other place. There's some pretty cool views of this stuff that show things like Route 66 cutting through the Southwest, culled from various people's photography. And then there's the Move On project that was one of our fairly early map projects from about 2004. This is in some ways most directly tied to the Oakland Crime Spotting project, just because it really shows that kind of personal citizen level view of the nation. The idea here is that people would use it as a virtual town hall application for meetings that Move On would sponsor. First one had like 50,000 guests on it. It was featured Michael Moore as a guest, talking about Fahrenheit 9/11, and provided a way for people to interact with Michael Moore, with Move On's people, and with each other. So that's kind of the context of where Oakland Crime Spotting came out of. It's about 4 years worth of doing mapping type research, and it's really coming out in the form of projects like Oakland Crime Spotting today. We still do this stuff commercially, but we're also doing it in this kind of research way. And please, interrupt at any point here, because I think it's more interesting to do this kind of thing with questions attached. What Oakland Crime Spotting seeks to do is to take this website, Crime Watch, something published by the city of Oakland and the Oakland PD, and make it a little bit more usable for people. We found that if you want to know about crime information currently in Oakland, what you get is this kind of disclaimer-laden, wizard-like application. You have to agree to this set of terms, you have to read this set of instructions, you have to really know what you're looking for ahead of time. I think this is really one of the needs that we were seeking to address, and one of the threads that we've been running through a number of our projects over the years, this idea that it's possible now, given that computers are reasonably fast and internet connections are reasonably fast, to sort of show everything first. It's possible to get straight to a map, see the whole deal, and then let people kind of peel back layers based on what's there. So we took the opposite approach from Crime Watch. In their situation, you have to pick and choose which specific crimes you're interested in. So here you might choose, all of them if you want to know about assault and alcohol and narcotics and everything else. You have to figure out where it is that you're interested in looking. So near addresses, near features, within boundaries. You have to figure out what your time period is. And that time period can't be something like a month ago. It has to be within the past month. So you don't get that kind of ability to browse back and forth in time. And then what you end up with is a map that takes a little bit of time to load, really shows you just a limitation. So here we've chosen around the Lake Merritt BART station area, and that's literally all you get. You get these little money bags that represent thefts, and then outside of this circle, it's kind of done. Like, even if something happened here in Channel Park, you can't see that because you've only selected the quarter-mile view of Lake Merritt station. And then the way to find out more information about the individual crimes is by clicking on these cryptic little icons and getting overlays like this that partially obscure the map and then sort of show information in this kind of law enforcement ease. You end up with uppercase information. The descriptions are, clearly written by police officers, clearly tuned for their own database records keeping systems, and don't really give you a whole lot of personal information about the people that are involved in the same way that something like the Not Just a Number project from the Tribune might do. It's something that we see like a lot of on journalistic databases of this sort. This is a recent piece from the Chronicle that's looking at bicyclist deaths on Bay Area roadways. they also took the position of putting all this stuff on a map, putting it into a database format. But I think even though it has this excellent view of where bicycle fatalities are happening around the Bay Area, it still puts you in that position of having to figure out what it is that you want before they show you anything. In other words, there's a certain lack of trust around you can handle the map as opposed to, okay, tell us where, tell us how they got hit, tell us, whether it happened at night or, in the daytime, and then maybe we'll show you a map that might have something on it, even though you don't actually know if it will going into the situation. So it's really kind of a pattern of development that we're trying to get away from. So where we started, and this is kind of where the project began as a personal thing, was just from my own frustration at looking at this Oakland PD website and realizing that it didn't do things like print out the address of where crimes occurred, or even a block level address. The only way you could geolocate this stuff was by looking at images stuck on these JPEG maps. So the output would look something like this, but the input would look something like this. So same general area, you've got all these little icons, you've got your kind of red boxing gloves for aggravated assaults, little blue needles for narcotics, a knife for a robbery. We think that these are really excellent as a way to kind of get a sense of what's going on, but it's a little bit misleading. Like maybe the robbery was with a gun but not a knife, yet they're showing the knife. So I think that there's kind of visual implications that a map like this makes that we weren't entirely happy with. Also, it's just kind of an interesting technical challenge. So this is the area around my house near Lake Merritt in downtown Oakland. And what we were interested in was how do you get from just that map to actually being able to figure out programmatically where all these things are so you can figure out their geolocation in the world and therefore expand this stuff out. We found that if a map like this is published by the Oakland PD, it's really hard for citizens to talk about it. If they can find this map and they know that there's the little green money bag over there by the lake, it's hard to take that URL and show it to somebody else and talk about it, with the police, with your representatives, with people in your neighborhood. Discussions around the Crime Watch application really tended to focus on this kind of, okay, go to the app, accept the thing, enter the following kind of crime, go for the last 90 days, and then you will see what's been going on in the neighborhood. It was really difficult to lift up a URL and send it to somebody and say, look, here's what's happening in our neighborhood. And I think that, even though it was built in 2000 and was state of the art at the time, there's different expectations around sharing information online currently that this piece doesn't quite address. It also has kind of a weird way of showing information. This is an example of some of the crime icons that we're looking for. So obviously, you've got a little car for auto theft. I've mentioned the knife and the syringe for narcotics and robbery, but then you have the big pink P, which refers to prostitution. So when you see a bunch of those, you know that there's prostitution arrests going on, but it's this kind of strange, cryptic thing. Vandalism is on the right in the purple spray can, and there's just tons of examples like this. Broken window for robberies, for burglaries, sorry. A little man yelling for disturbing the peace. It's kind of strange iconography. And the technical aspect of this stuff was really just using tools like the Python imaging library and various kinds of HTTP libraries and so on to kind of pick these maps apart and do some pattern matching and figure out where these icons were located. As I said, it was just a personal project initially, so this was weekend time spent figuring out how do you find a little knife on a map and then map it to the actual location in the world where that thing might have taken place. So this is about where we got to with the image parsing thing. And that was running for a solid year throughout most of 2007. We got to a point where we were engaged in a bit of a tug-of-war match with the Oakland Police Department. They turned us off, we switched machines, they turned that machine off. It was really kind of a not acrimonious situation, but they definitely weren't happy with what we were doing, largely because we represented a hefty allocation of resources on their end, even though they were unwilling to do things like publish block-level addresses that would make all of this stuff unnecessary. So at some point, we decided to start doing this in a distributed fashion. These are screen grabs from a browser plugin that we built that would allow citizens in Oakland to help us with this process so that it was more kind of scattered around town as opposed to coming from a single blockable location. But we don't do this anymore because at some point, the city of Oakland basically called us up and said, hey, remember that data that you asked for? Like, We've talked about it for 6 months, and now we're going to give it to you. So we got to a point where the map information they were publishing became supplemented with something more like a textual tabular database of the sort that Adrian was working with in Chicago. This is what's on their website. What they've given us is kind of a private view of this stuff, so that we have an Excel spreadsheet that we download once every night. It contains the last 60 to 70 days worth of crime or so. Each one of those things contains a block level address, like 400 block of West Grand Avenue, and then we can put that on a map in a much more speedy and reliable fashion than snipping little pink peas out of maps and figuring out what that means. So where it goes is the provision of something like a linkable, stable piece of information that the citizens of Oakland can use. This is something that's really important to us, and something that, even though we do a lot of these kind of swishing, moving, flashing, blinky maps, it's really vital that those things be somehow, that you can hold them as a user. So even though you're moving the Trulia map to go to your town or kind of panning someplace else, there's a point you get to at which you want to kind of copy and paste that URL and send it to somebody, and being able to have a conversation about what you see. So with the Oakland Crime Spotting Project, it became really important early on for us to provide something like that for users. So in addition to the map view, where you can see the entire city, kind of cut it down to different crime levels, there's also a more list view, like what I showed earlier on. So here you have a full database of the past month's crime reports. You can narrow it down just to robberies. You can narrow it down just to robberies on Monday, March 17th. So here you're down to kind of 2 crime reports. You can get a sense of like, okay, there was only 2 of these things that happened that day. Navigate forward, backwards, see what else is going on near these things, and then drill into an individual crime report. So this is March 5th. A murder happened. Looks like it's in West Oakland, just south of the 580. And this is a permanent link. So this page has a URL that contains this map. It's something that you can share with people. It's something that you can see related events on. So as you scroll down this page, you can see that in addition to this murder, other events that were connected to this case number are attempted murder, 2 other counts of murder. I don't know if that actually means that 3 people in total were killed on this day. It's really hard to tell from their database, but this is the police record system kind of made public for people. So right away, you can start to see that there's relationships between all these different crimes connected on pages like this. If you scroll down further, you can see a commenting feature that we have started to roll out slowly over the course of the past month. Our sort of initial criticism of the Oakland police database page was that it was a very mute kind of system. You could go and you could figure out information, but there wasn't really a way to actually connect that to other people that are living in that area. It wasn't kind of an object of conversation that you could have. And so it kind of became a dead zone in some ways on the internet. Until we added the commenting feature, I think that our site really suffered from that as well. In other words, you can come to these pages and you can talk about this stuff, but there wasn't a place for you to leave a mark on the site. So we created this commenting feature where really what we're trying to get people to do is to find mentions in the news about the events that are being linked here and make it possible for people to augment those things with information. So in this case, a murder happened, but there's also a KTVU story about that event. So in addition to seeing the time, the date, what happened, you can also get some information about what local news channels have about that stuff. And then if you keep scrolling down that page, you get further down to just nearby reports, like what's going on in the context of the neighborhood. In this case, you've got a burglary and a narcotics arrest that all happened kind of within that 12-hour window, someplace close to where this murder happened. So if you have a situation like a car theft, for example, where the nearby reports area is blank, you know that it's kind of a freak occurrence in that neighborhood. Whereas in this case, if there was like 20 things here, which there sometimes are, you know that you're in a pretty rough neighborhood or a busy neighborhood, or maybe the cops are doing a sting that night or something, but you really get a sense of there being a lot of activity around what's happening there, as opposed to, say, a vehicle theft up in the hills someplace where you won't have any kind of other activity for hours or days in each direction. A lot of pattern kind of work came out of this. I think that once you aggregate this information extensively, you can begin to ask questions about what's there. This is kind of lampooned a little bit in The Simpsons.
Are you sitting down? Good. I wish to report a robbery.
A robbery, right. Thanks for the report. There's another one, Lou. 723 Evergreen Terrace. Well, there doesn't seem to be any pattern yet, but if I take this one and move it here, and move these over here, hello, it almost looks like an arrow.
Hey, look, Chief, it's pointing right at this police station.
Let's get out of here!
So we don't have quite the same kind of obvious pattern that comes out of this, but I think that there's kind of a popular notion about, you know, the cops standing around the map and moving pins around and trying to figure out if it makes a pentagram and, you know, where the burglar is going to hit next. We haven't seen those same kind of patterns come out of this, but we have seen a few that we think are fairly interesting. So this is looking at about a 2 weeks worth of complete crime information across the entire city from sometime in mid-March, I think. And if you start to cut it down, using these selectors down here to just the green ones, which is how we've colored kind of property crimes like vandalism and burglary and arson and things like that, you can see that they're pretty evenly distributed around town with some clusters in the east and some clusters around the Fruitvale area. But really, when you get north of the 13 freeway, nothing happens up there. It's kind of a dead zone. You get the occasional car theft, but you really find that crime is kind of focused between those two freeways, north and east of the 880 and south and west of the 13. If you look at just the violent crimes, which would be things like murder, robbery, various kinds of assault, it's kind of further limited. It basically moves you down from the 13 to south and west of 580 and still north and east of 880. So we've been thinking that this is kind of an interesting way to look at crime. Instead of it just being about, you know, my neighborhood, what's happening, there's kind of a broader view that you can take of this. And you see this in the news, you know, when you read about like the 10th murder that happened in town this month, then typically that'll be somehow qualified with, you know, at this time last year there were 9 murders or there were 11 murders, you know, whatever that crime happens to be. I think that kind of qualification tends to happen with the bigger, showier crimes like homicide, but it's, I think, to me personally, really interesting to be able to do that same kind of navigation and investigation work on stuff like car thefts, on things like robberies. It's just, you know, much more kind of personally affecting but less newsworthy stuff that makes it out there. I mentioned the prostitution stuff earlier. One of the patterns that we found in those pink peas on the maps was that they really happen in clusters, like where something like, I don't know, narcotics arrests might happen all over a certain chunk of town. We found that prostitution arrests in particular are really limited just to certain areas and also certain times. So you have like 2 or 3 weeks go by where the Oakland PD is arresting nobody for prostitution, and then you have a situation like this where on one particular night they started at one end of International Boulevard and drove to the other, just picking up prostitutes along the way like that. So these times would be like, you know, 6, 6:10, 6:20, 6:30, 7 o'clock. They really just kind of drive down. You see this pattern here in International and also up in West Oakland around San Pablo Avenue. We thought it was really interesting that you could actually see something of the administrative function of what the Oakland police were doing in this kind of view. It wouldn't have occurred to me that that was something that they planned and kind of ran out to get in this way. A third sort of pattern that we found that was a little bit surprising was focused on West Oakland. I used to live in West Oakland. It had a pretty bad reputation for a lot of the time, but somehow when I was living there, I never really had the sense of being in any kind of fear or danger. It was just like, well, it's a rough neighborhood. What are you gonna do? It's okay. I can walk around here late at night and not feel unsafe. And so one of the things that we were looking at was the distribution of things like violent crimes around West Oakland. And what we found after looking at the site for a period of time kind of jived with what I thought about that part of town, which is that it looks a whole lot rougher than it is. So you've got, you know, a number of robberies, a number of assaults, but they're really spread around at about the same rate as you get, you know, east of the lake, north of the lake, et cetera. Like you don't see anything like a particular cluster here.
You don't have any murders.
Sorry?
There are no murders in that map in West Oak.
Are there none? Yeah, no, you're right, there really aren't any. They might be obscured, like behind other icons, but we might have also just chosen a week here where, you know, it was quiet, I guess. They certainly do happen, but I think that East Oakland, for whatever reason, seems to be a more dangerous part of town than West Oakland is, if you go by this kind of statistical view. So that's the kind of even distribution of violent crimes, but if you just focus it down to narcotics arrests, you find that it's much more clustered. You get like, kind of one out there by the lake, which who knows what that is. But if you look at that area east of San Pablo, south of 580, and west of 980, it's like a huge cluster. And if you drive around that neighborhood, you kind of get a sense for why. Like it's pretty run down. There's a lot of people out there just, all parts of the day that don't have jobs. I don't really know what they do. But what you find is that when the prostitution stings happen, they happen along San Pablo Avenue, and then you also get all this drug activity around there. So you really get a sense from this map that it's not dangerous, but it's definitely a problem zone. So, as a regular person, I wouldn't feel bad walking around that part of town, but you would definitely get that sense of like, sirens, cop cars driving around. Like it's a pretty busy, pretty active part of town. It's hard to say why, but I can imagine that this might be an entree into thinking about, clusters of crimes and kind of thinking about this information at a slightly higher level than the individual report level. So it's not just, Joe Blow got arrested for selling weed. It's a pattern, it's a cluster, it's, more this month than last month. It's a more statistical way of thinking about this stuff that we think is afforded by these kind of views.
Can you select on time of day?
Not on time of day, no. You could do it using the data that we publish, but the interface that we made does it strictly by, from this time of day on a certain day all the way through, 24-hour cycles to another day. So this bar chart in the lower left-hand corner there represents about a month's worth. Each column is one day, and you can move that left and right over time. But definitely selecting by time of day is something that we've gotten a lot of requests for. We just haven't quite figured out the right way to represent that visually. There's a lot of kind of gotchas involved in that kind of navigation. And so we've been trying to see if the data that we publish is in any way picked up by people that are interested in that kind of view, and just to kind of see what other people might come up with.
Interesting if you could animate it on time of day, just start at 6 o'clock and then, within every half hour or every 15 minutes, just have it light up.
Yeah, we've been thinking about things like doing two kinds of time cuts. So you would do like, the week of March 17th, but then you might also say, show me only morning, evening, afternoon kind of reports that happen there. I think something like a more radial clock interface would probably be the right way to think about that. We're just not there yet, unfortunately. One of the changes we did make in response to people's demand, though, is the reintroduction of police beats. So initially, when I was getting interested in the Crime Watch website, I was looking at the city council district, police beats, police service areas, and thinking that these were all kind of artificial ways of cutting up the city. I didn't know what my police beat was. I didn't know what my PSA was. I didn't even really know what my city council district was. So I kind of jettisoned all of that early on in favor of kind of a pan-geographic area of just thinking purely about near my house, near my work, between the two, kind of not drawing lines around town. One of the things that we started hearing from our users pretty early on was that police beats are a lot more important than we thought they were in particular. Nobody cared much about city council districts, but people really cared about police beats because that turns out to be the kind of administrative interface that the police publish for themselves. So if you're talking to your local police officer, they come from a particular beat. They have other officers that work that particular beat. They have monthly meetings for that particular beat. And so knowing that something is happening, north of 14th Street there actually turns out to be super important for when you're dealing with your local police officers, because as soon as you stray over these boundaries, then you have other people that you need to talk to and other meetings you have to go to. And it has all kinds of implications. So quickly, we figured out how to get a map of all the police beats onto this thing, because this was obviously an important way to work.
Is this at all similar to the CompStat systems that police departments are using for fighting crime?
I don't actually know anything about that. Is it?
It sort of compiles crime statistics
Uh-huh.
and maps so that they sort of know where to target their resources best.
Is it like a product that police officers buy, or?
It was big in New York in the, I guess in the 90s, right, the Giuliani administration, and
Uh-huh.
Commissioner Bratton sort of was his brainchild that something fought crime and sort of
Yeah.
priced out.
I mean, the product that we're scraping to get this information, or I should say that we were scraping to get this information, I think bills itself as such a system. So the piece that's publicly viewable on the web is just one aspect of it, but then I think what the police department has is an internal view that has, clusters and hotspots and trends and so on, but for whatever reason, they don't make that public. You'd think they would. I think part of the reason is that they have a whole lot more that they're not showing in there. So obviously things like sexual assault are not shown on this map for privacy reasons, for a number of other reasons. And I think that the police internally have all of that available to them, but then they only choose this kind of thin layer of stuff you might care about if you're on your way to the shopping market and don't want to get assaulted type crime reporting. White collar crime is not there. Any kind of domestic abuse type stuff tends not to be there unless it spills out into the street in some way. But the beat stuff, I don't know, it was really eye-opening for me personally because it was kind of cool to see people engage with this to the point where it wasn't just like, oh, thanks, good site, but thank you, can you add this thing so that I can have this be more useful? So we created permanent links for each of the beats around Oakland that included a map like this that links to the interactive one, and then also things like downloadable spreadsheets that you could use if you were a resident of that beat to see what exactly is happening there.
Did you say that you guys got Excel files at the end of the day, and then I'm assuming someone manually punches it into the system, that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
Did you ever talk to them about whether their system can feed directly in, like the XML or something like that, or is that even feasible?
Yeah, we've definitely talked about it, and they have expressed some interest. I think the problem that, well, maybe it's not a problem, maybe it's a feature, but the thing that we really discovered was that the wheels there turn super slowly.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it went from, oh my God, you have a website, we're shutting you down, to here is some data over the course of like 6 months. And that wasn't 6 months of heated negotiations, it was 6 months of like, okay, we'll talk about it at the next meeting. Like,
We've talked about doing something like this in my paper for quite a long time, but I do really want to, but also don't want to spend 2 hours every day typing in.
yeah, and I think that's really what happens on their end too. I mean, all these things, like if you actually report a crime to the police, they write it down, and it's all, it's kind of, it's done by hand and then ultimately fed into a records management system. Sorry, I'm getting a piece of paper shown to me. It's ultimately fed into a records management system that's computerized, but there's a delay. So if you look at, well, I won't scroll back, but there was that kind of sparkline bar chart in the lower left showing time. It always has this characteristic kind of fall-off pattern as you get closer to today. And the reason for that is that on Tuesday, they might know about 10 or 15 things that happened on Monday. On Wednesday, they'll know about 50, and then by Thursday, all of that stuff will have actually made it in. So it's been an interesting problem in terms of notifying people. We have email notifications that go out every day about this stuff, and, sorry, okay.
I'm wondering, you said you have a permanent link for the beat.
Uh-huh.
Can you interact with the beat the same way you can, say, your main map?
Not quite. Only the main map is the one that's actually interactive in that way. The beat, like if you see a map like this on the beat, it'll be static, so reproducible, pastable in email and so on. But if you click on it, it takes you to zoomed into that particular area and that particular chunk of time on the main map. Something that we haven't done yet is to bring these beat boundaries into the main map.
And if you could just repeat the question just so we can get it to the webcast.
Okay.
What type of people do you find go to the site, and as you've added more features, has the traffic increased? Or is are these mostly like gadflies, or are these regular people who are interested?
So the question was, what kind of people go to the site and has traffic increased? I think we actually haven't really paid too much attention to the traffic for some reason. We've been paying more attention to the kind of email that we receive for this thing. So at first it was a lot of like, oh my God, thank you, this is great. And then over time, we found that we would get the gadflies that you mentioned, and we would also get people that just generally care about whatever their neighborhood is. So one of the nicest things that we heard about this was from a guy in the 1X beat, which I think is kind of Jack London Square area. And his name is Simon, and basically what his takeaway from this whole thing was, oh, it's great. Like now I actually have information that historically, we'd have these meetings with the police and they would show us the information, and we never saw this before. So, the first half of the meeting would be wasted just like how many car crimes happened. Now they can go in and say, okay, we know there were 5. Let's talk about what that actually is. So I think that, it kind of goes up into this kind of local concern area, and then it also goes down into the gadflies. And gadflies, I don't know, I think they come in all kinds of different shapes. Some of them are just kind of graffiti warriors, and then others are concerned about very specific kind of tiny slices of crime. So one of the things that we found from lurking on the various PSA mailing lists that Oakland police support is that people think about crimes over time in terms of individual properties, like a problem house in their neighborhood. We were finding that there was a lot of email traffic going on these lists connected to a specific house in East Oakland that the residents thought was a drug dealing house. So they would do things like whenever they found on our map something that was connected to that neighborhood, they would basically republish it and be like, see, you've got another, assault here, another narcotics charge, or another, vehicle theft outside. And they were using that to try to establish a pattern of problem activity in that house, as opposed to point to any specific report. I don't know exactly what's going on with that particular situation, but I think they're basically just trying to get the whole thing shut down by the police because they think there's drug dealing going
It's
on.
nice that you have the luxury of not looking at the traffic stats, but I think a lot of our news organizations, they're going to say, what is the investment relative to the payoff? And
Right.
How do you make that determination? What is a success in something like this? I mean,
Right.
if 500 people in the neighborhood have seen that this is, are able to use it,
Uh-huh.
is that enough? To
Right.
justify the expense and the time?
Right. So the question was, how do you justify the expense and time depending on how many people use this thing? I don't know if I have a good answer for that, unfortunately. I mean, like you were saying, we are in a somewhat luxurious position where we don't actually have to care how many people are visiting this thing. I think partially also, one of the reasons that we're not really too concerned about it is because we have this feeling that the data that comes out of these things is not necessarily tied to the number of visitors. So you get something like a spreadsheet that comes out of the site, and then that becomes useful in something like a neighborhood crime prevention council meeting. And that's data that's been delivered from the site into the hands of these people that then have something to talk about, but that doesn't mean that any of them are going back and visiting the site. It has a slightly more kind of side utility that isn't strictly connected to like ad impressions and so on.